Hi, good morning, and welcome to Observer Research Foundation's ORF's Fellow Seminar. I think we do it twice a month, every month, and so this is the second Fellow Seminar for the month of July. Today's discussion is being facilitated by Dr. Manu Joshi's fantastic paper on US-China decoupling in the era of COVID-19. And like Dr. Joshi points out in the paper, we may not have used the terminology of decoupling specifically, but I think the early trend towards this has been on for a while now. And some of this is natural given the rising wages in China. So companies are always looking for wage advantages, so moving out of China to other countries and so on and so forth. So this process has been on for a while. But I think in more recent times, there are more other competitive factors. China's theft of technology has been an issue for decades, but that has achieved some bit of seriousness, I would say, as China has become more powerful, stronger in international and regional fora. And more recently, the increasing tensions driven by a number of reasons in the last 6 months or so, including the COVID-19, but China's aggressive behavior across everyone in the neighborhood to far and wide, everyone from Sweden to Canada, and of course, using economic coercion as a state policy against countries such as Australia has caused a huge amount of pushback towards China and given way to more newer trends such as decoupling. So problems with China, not just for the US, but I believe that it's for the whole world. And this has been going on, and the world has been trying to do a pushback in a gradual fashion for a while. This is also a function of the changing geopolitics, the changing balance of power equations. And so this is bound to happen. And if we are going to be entering a new age of Cold War, I see this as a logical step. But as Dr. Joshi says, this is not going to be easy and done in any hurry because of the extensive hold of China of the market and the supply chain as of now. And so finding alternative feasible options will be a work in progress for some time. But I think the decoupling is going to happen because you cannot continue with the Chinese aggressive behavior. So unless China changes its behavior in a dramatic fashion, which I highly doubt, this is bound to happen. So given that we have about just about an hour to go, I'm going to invite Dr. Manu Joshi to present his arguments, findings, and major conclusions. This will be followed by two commentators, Ms. Trisha Ray and Dr. Jebin Jacob. Trisha Ray is a junior fellow at ORF Cyber Initiative. She focused on the security implications of emerging technologies as well as AI norms. Prior to this, Trisha was a program assistant at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, DC, where she researched and wrote on national AI strategies in Asia, nuclear issues, and India-US security relations. Jebin Jacob, the second commentator, is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shivanadar University and an adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. He's co-editor with Hong Tho An of the Vietnamese Institute of Chinese Studies of a new volume titled China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Policies under Xi Jinping, released by Palgrave Macmillan last month. He's currently working on a new book on India's China policymaking. So I think we have a terrific panel to look at this particular issue. And first, let me now invite Dr. Manu Joshi to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deglobalization. And in advance, I can thank the discussants out here. This is actually a kind of a companion paper to two papers I have written last year. One was on China and Europe on trade and technology. The other was US and China on trade and technology. And so as 2018, 2019 have developed, we have seen the issue go from the point of deglobalization, move to the concept of decoupling, meaning things have been happening rather fast in this. And so this paper I finished in June, looking at, and COVID, of course, has come along, which has focused a lot of the issue because many countries realize that we need resiliency, for example, in medical equipment production. Meaning they were caught short when they suddenly found out that they could only acquire, everything was from China. And in February, China itself was down. And so this has triggered issue. I'm going to just, I put some of these things in a PowerPoint presentation. Now let me see if I can get it up. so I'm looking at this the issue of decoupling, and so first of all is the question of China itself. See, engineered by an authoritarian kind of a system, guided which has guided a market-oriented industrial base. Now these issues have come up now. That can you have an authoritarian system which is using part market, and this has created its own set of problems. But today, China is huge. It is accounting for 13% of the world exports and 18% of the world market capitalization. So what many people wonder is China unstoppable? This question is unsettling the world, in particular, the world leader, because the US, it is intrinsically linked to its geopolitical hegemony. The deglobalization to decoupling, the idea of deglobalization itself started coming up after the global financial crisis of 2008. And now, as I said, things we are talking about decoupling. This has two drivers, political and the technological. Politically, it's being driven by Trump's China policies. Technologically, it's being driven by the fear of Chinese dominance in the area of technology. And the COVID experience has only enhanced this process. Now, deglobalization process, we have seen that there has also been a tendency towards what is called reshoring and nearshoring. That means having your supply chains closer home to you. Now, along with the signs of deglobalization have been many. One of them has been the fact that the WTO's Doha round, we've not been able to complete. The collapse of the TPP is another sign. Political pressures, meaning in the United States, people complaining about loss of jobs, rising wages. Then there are technological trends like 3D printing and automation, which many countries now say that these things we can do at home. With 3D printing and with automation, a lot of stuff can be done at home. Politically, it's been played up by politicians, especially with people who've lost their jobs. One consequence we have seen of this is the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which was pushed by the US and which is now going to rejig the supply chain for automobiles in favor of North America. So this becomes kind of nearshoring and reshoring. Decoupling is actually more complex than it sounds. There are two aspects here, the Chinese and more recently, the American. The Chinese have sought to develop their IT. You see, the Chinese actually were the first to decouple. They set up their entire information technology system and they set up the Great Firewall, as we know, and they walled themselves off from the rest of the world. And they sought to develop and dominate. You see, the second thing that they have of decoupling, I call it decoupling because what they're doing is they're trying to create exclusive supply chains so that to develop the dependency of others on them. And the US and the other countries have just about realized this. But issues have gotten accelerated by COVID. Now, the problem is, you know, the Chinese have a vast market share. I mean, so if you look at the figures, they are incredible. Here are some figures of China's biggest exports. And you will notice in these figures that many of the Chinese partners, they are nearshored, meaning whether it is South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, they are nearshored for China, but they are very far off from the US. Whether it is imports or export, the Chinese have within their own area, which they are seeking geopolitical dominance, there are the bulk of their partners. You know, here are the figures of the trade partners: South Korea, import Japan, Taiwan, US, Germany. Export is US, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. I just want to point this out because this question of nearshoring and decoupling are coming up together. Now, decoupling, I pointed out, Chinese Atmanirbharta, they started the Great Wall. They built up their own companies there, Baidu, Sina, Alibaba, Tencent, and no one else is allowed to operate inside their internet. They have secured their IT industry. One of their concerns has been the Snowden revelations about the backdoor systems in Cisco systems and others. since 2000, China has actually encouraged the policies of Atmanirbharta. Successive plans, if you look at the various plans, have called for national indigenous innovation capability and ensuring re-innovation of key technologies at home has been a major issue in China. And then comes the Made in China 2025. Now, this is nothing but a China first industrial policy. So as I said, China decoupled its information segment from the world, but it wants to emerge as the dominant technological power with everyone coupled to it. It has a sophisticated system of absorbing foreign technology through license, purchase, or espionage, and using state institutions to subsidize key industries and promote them. So this then went into the MIC 2025 plan and the new generation artificial intelligence development plan of 2017. Despite all this, China has certain key weaknesses, such as semiconductors, computer operating systems, aero engines, precision bearings. They still remain major weaknesses. In the case of semiconductors, we have seen just how weak China is. One of their companies collapsed, Fujian Jinhua, collapsed because of the US withdrew its license. Now, simultaneous to this Made in China 2025 is the Belt and Road Initiative to redraw maritime and overland transportation links and create supply chains that will be dominated physically and politically by China. And then, of course, is the Digital Silk Road, seeking to develop fiber optic networks to promote connectivity, again linked to BRI. Now, when you look at this decoupling, deglobalization, regionalization, domestic politics, new manufacturing technology, e-marketing, high wage rates in China were altering the landscape of globalization anyway. Low-end firms were going off to Southeast Asia. And I have given the example of the USMCA. Now, these were global trends that were occurring. But then in February, when we had shutdowns in South Korea and Japan because of COVID, this alerted to countries to the dangers of being too dependent on one country, meaning COVID suddenly made people aware of this problem. Now the trends of nearshoring and reshoring are melding into decoupling. So before the COVID thing, there was already a pushback developing. The US had begun the crackdown on Chinese IT companies. Europe had instituted new rules to restrict Chinese investment. The US has cracked down on denying China US semiconductors to power Chinese products. And the US-China spat has pushed some companies, especially in Japan and South Korea, to relocate in Southeast Asia. Now, the pushback after the COVID experience has come with regard to medicines, medical equipment like ventilators, etc. Public health has been added to the issues that contribute to national security. Earlier, people never thought of public health security as an issue. Japan has put up a $2.3 billion fund to reshore industry. Voices in Europe, and when I say voices in Europe, this is really Chancellor Merkel, who has been speaking of the importance of maintaining sovereignty on the pillar of domestic production. US pushback, of course, has been the most visible. I think I've lost track here. Yeah. It's most visible in the US. So it began as a political effort by the Trump administration to redress the, what they said was a bad trade balance, but it has morphed into a technology war where the US is using its formidable power to block the rise of China's cutting edge 5G technology. Now it's a straightforward technology war. The US does not want another country to be a dominant force in any cutting edge technology area. And 5G definitely is a revolutionary cutting edge technology. In the process, the US is signaling that it has no desire to be linked in any way to Chinese technology. Now I've given you this thing of Japan. So some of these points I've already raised. I'm not going to review them. There's already been a crackdown on the Chinese IT companies. I've listed them out here. DJI drones, another big area. Drones, Chinese companies are dominant. Rules for restricting export of emerging technologies have also come up. like artificial intelligence, restrictions on visas for Chinese, engineering and mathematics and students. Now in April, the rules on restriction of exports of dual-use items have come up, and now in the US, there's been talk of putting up a $25 billion reshoring fund. And again, in April, there was this $12 billion investment by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Now, this is the biggest, most formidable company in the world, located in Taiwan. And the US has effectively, by its rules, broken the TSMC linkages with the People's Republic of China. TSMC is going to set up a plant in the US instead. Now, the future US actions, if the decoupling continues, we might see all the made in China 2025 areas being covered. Here are they listed: IT, high-end CNC, aerospace, etc., etc. So the entire future of Chinese industrialization could be jeopardized. And the US could use these two statutes, International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Defense Production Act, because many US companies are reluctant to break with China because that's where they're hugely profitable. But dependency is a two-way street. While consumer electronics are made in China, they still rely on US semiconductors. Likewise, business dependency. US, Japanese, European companies depend on Chinese market to remain profitable back home. COVID has made countries more conscious of their dependency. And if push comes to shove, many countries, if forced, will go with China. In the Indo-Pacific, China is the biggest trade partner of almost all the countries, and breaking that is not going to be easy. And as the US and China break, businesses will seek new friends and partners and play both markets to the extent they can. Here is just a graphic representation of China's strength, 28% of the world's manufacturing, industrial base, which is unparalleled in breadth and depth. This is very important. I think the industrial base, we often don't understand how broad and deep it is. Then it's China's own vast market. This is what tempts many of the companies in South Korea, Japan, United States. Now, just an example, in May 2020, China accounted for 30% of the imports of Japan. And in April, China accounted for 24% of the European imports. India, just by the way, COVID crash we have talked of Atmanirbharta. There's been talk of reshoring companies from China. The US is also saying that you can become a trusted partner of the United States. But the problem is that India is reluctant to open up its economy, and it remains a high-cost, low-quality economy. A country which has stayed out of RCEP and which is very reluctant to sign up trade deals, as it's happening in the case of European Union and the US, is unlikely that some of these companies will come to India. Conclusion: domestic politics, new manufacturing technology, e-marketing, high wage rates have altered the landscape, which I explained to you. COVID has encouraged the policy of reshoring and nearshoring. But decoupling is a different issue. Supply chains are far more complex, and the Chinese have a huge upstream and downstream grip on them. I'm saying if you look at just electrical vehicle batteries, from the mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the factories of the CATL, they're all Chinese dominated. Meaning from the raw material. So often people don't realize that supply chain doesn't just mean one component or one item, but the entire upstream and downstream process. So I think what I'm arguing is that we are more likely in the near future to see a China plus one strategy. That means countries will be in China, but they will try and develop one or other alternate country as well. In the longer term, possibly we may actually see the emergence of two technospheres. But it's not that simple, because in this whole globalization, the research, patents, finance is a very important area which I have not, focused on too much. Contracts, supply chains, technical standards, link Chinese and Western technologies, and breaking them is not going to happen in quick order. But either way, the world cannot avoid looking frontally at the fact that the world trading system has been damaged fatally. Now, this is, as I've described in my paper, this has been happening since the global financial crisis. The trading system has not been too well. Britain's recent decision on Huawei was not about trading rules, but about lobbying. Because, you know, Britain was the only country which was actually carrying out a security audit of Huawei for the last 6 to 7 years. They actually had professionals looking at Huawei equipment. Removing each other's digital imprint across the world of manufactured products will be an impossible endeavor. Meaning these things are there in components, assemblies, sub-assemblies. There are components, subcomponents, etc. And that's very complicated. As a result, you know, the trade war, tariffs have gone up. Now what has happened is, because the trade war, average tariffs in the US have gone up 20%. Someone is paying for it, meaning what globalization was predicated on was low tariffs, and that everyone gained, that you had cheap goods that you could buy in the markets. Now everything is if you enter the era of decoupling, everything changes. What we do need is a new trade regime that will take into account the problems we have faced. That is the digital economy, the increased influence of the state over the private sector in China. So many of the things that China has done, many of the things that we have issues with China, they have to be addressed by a new trade regime. So we should be able to maximize trade even while providing for strategic security. Because otherwise what is happening is, we are providing for security, but then trade is declining. And that's not good for anyone. So I'll just conclude here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. That was a very, again, like your paper, you actually brought out the presentation also in very simple, very lucid terms, and thank you for that. Let me now, you got some interesting points, but I'm going to come to that at a later stage. Right now, I'll go to our two commentators, but before that, to the audience, let me tell them that we have a Q&A option button on the screen. So please feel free to drop your questions, and we'll try and take as many as possible once the Q&A starts. Over to you, Trisha.
Thank you, Raji. Dr. Joshi, I really liked the measured approach you took in your paper and your very frank assessment of the realities of decoupling viewed from these multiple geographical lenses. I especially liked this line from your conclusion, which is, if the world system cleaves in two, India's geopolitical and economic orientation would make it a natural fit in the US camp. But if India wants to pursue its ambitious goals of becoming a manufacturing power, it cannot afford to break with East Asia value chains. And that really kind of captures the dilemma India is in. So I would like to make a somewhat meta observation about the way decoupling from China is often framed, especially in US strategic and policy circles, but also now increasingly in Indian popular discourse as well. So decoupling implies the erasure of all interlinkages, and it's to some extent a direct result of this muddling we are seeing of geopolitics, technology, and national security. And so where interlinkages were once seen as deterrence to conflict, according to the entire liberal framework, they're now seen as vulnerabilities. And with this framing, we fall into this decoupling spiral. And so all linkages, no matter how small or in what sector, become threats. And everything is framed then as a zero-sum game where only one can win. And it's not only China that will fall victim to this narrative. India has been at the receiving end of such framing as well. Because if threats to their competitive edge and strategic advantage is how the DC policy circle and West Point views the world, every single move made by China will be seen as somehow threatening to the US. I mean, you can look to the skies, you can see China's growing dominance of communication satellites. You look to the seas where Huawei Marine is now capturing about 115 contracts for undersea cables, which are, for many countries, their only link to the world. And of course, there are some justifiable reasons to be concerned about China, which your paper has highlighted, and in India as well. There is a justifiable wariness of Chinese presence in certain sectors. And for instance, with the app ban, there was concerns regarding China's weak privacy regulations, with broad exemptions on grounds of social harmony and national security. There are also questionable data and snooping practices by apps like TikTok. And then the legitimate threat of allowing an unfriendly state to build our 5G networks. But this decoupling spiral narrative also has two results. One is that it can also result in harmful narratives. For instance, you had the conspiracy theory of 5G causing COVID, which was a direct result of viewing China as the enemy. And then the perception recently that all Indian startups and tech companies that have Chinese investment should be boycotted, which ends up just harming Indian workers and Indian businesses. And the second result is we should not ignore deficiencies in our own policy frameworks. Our own data protection regulations, for instance, have much to be desired, especially our own very broad exemptions for government snooping. There are also a couple of tropes one can see in this narrative, which your paper has spoken about as well. One is techno-nationalism. There's also the new Cold War. And all of this really feeds into this all of us versus all of them narrative, which can take away from the fact that no country is a monolith. The Indian government does not represent all voices in India. The Trump administration does not represent all of the US, and the CCP does not represent all of China. And it would be wise for us to also pay attention to the other voices in these geographies. And so I want to conclude by saying that while it is tempting to view the world in binaries, decision makers especially should not be giving in to that temptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. Some very interesting points. Let me now move on to, and you're stuck to the time. Thank you for that. Let me move to Jabin to make his comments on the paper and on the broader subject. Over to you, Jabin.
Thank you, Raji. And let me also add to Trisha's words by saying that I quite enjoyed Dr. Joshi's paper. It's both a broad-ranging paper without ever getting out of hand or straying from the central theme. I'm going to look at, frame this from the point of view of missed opportunities, perhaps. So two big points. One is that, as Dr. Joshi mentions right up front, that this process of deglobalization and of decoupling has been underway for some time. I think it's important to understand that in this particular instance, this was not initiated by the US, but by China when it started employing economic coercion of its neighbors, as well as countries further afield, whether you talk about the Norwegians being targeted for inviting the Dalai Lama, or the Australians being targeted by blocking their products, or as the example has been mentioned of blocking rare earths to Japan in 2010. Alongside decoupling, there has also been an unwillingness to, well, it's an unfortunate expression, but an unwillingness to couple. Take the case of India. The Chinese have actively blocked Indian products or areas or sectors where India has been strong in for a very long time. And even the latest instance in which the Chinese finally agreed to Indian pharmaceutical products entering their market has been actually driven not by Indian persuasion, but the fact by the reality that the Chinese wanted their public health insurance systems to be cheaper, and therefore cheaper Indian medicines were useful to them. And Dr. Joshi does mention this. He does say that China did not say things out loud, but its policies and plans spoke for themselves. And therefore, I think one must wonder if in India, at least, whether we missed a trick by giving the Chinese such a long rope, by continuing to expect our products will have a space in the Chinese market, by continuing to give the Chinese greater space in the Indian market for a decade and more. And now, we are left neither here nor there, especially even though the US and the Chinese are engaged in this decoupling process. Trying to make a choice between the two is not exactly the best situation for us. Second is the question of techno-nationalism. He did not mention it in his presentation, but there's a fair bit of discussion in the paper. Again, I think this is an area where perhaps the rest of the world missed a few things about China. Technonationalism is nothing new as far as the CPC is concerned. There's been a history of attempts at indigenous innovation. In India, we call it the temples of modern India, but in China, what resulted was a great leap forward on the one hand, but also an extremely skilled labor force ready to become the factory of the world at the end of the 1970s. Now, it's also technonationalism that resulted, in a sense, from the withdrawing in the withdrawing of Soviet scientists following the Sino-Soviet rift, and it has essentially always existed in China. But the US turned a blind eye to it because it was attracted by the huge market. And again, like India, the US companies, Google, Facebook, also tried continuously to try and persuade the Chinese to open up their markets, but it was simply not going to happen. That should have been another warning bell. And now cut to the present, you have technonationalism in a sense in India as well, when India bans 59 apps of the Chinese or talks about Atmanirbharta. But perhaps, this is coming too late. As again, Dr. Joshi points out in his paper, that the US has discovered that many of its defense industries are reliant on the Chinese as sole suppliers in many components. Now, in of itself, it's perhaps this realization, even as late as it comes, is not a bad thing. Technonationalism is not necessarily a bad thing in the sense that India has many lessons to learn from the Chinese. It's something I've argued elsewhere, whether being honest in this particular sort of global environment is particularly a good thing. The Chinese have engaged in thievery of the highest order, but they got their interests, they met their interests. And the thievery, but it's important to remember that thievery stealing was met by investments in R&D and education. Another point that Dr. Joshi underlines. The money doesn't only go for a few civilian officials going for a MPA at Harvard, but also into supporting PhDs in the Ivy League in the US. I mean, of Chinese, regular Chinese attempting or going for PhDs, all supported by the government. Now, I'd like to ask you this question: how many Indian PhDs in the sciences and the social sciences have been supported by the Indian government in the Ivy League, in Europe, elsewhere? And you look at the record, it speaks for itself. Alongside, the Chinese also twisted the arms of their state-owned enterprises and private sector to invest more in R&D. You compare the R&D budgets of Chinese companies, including public sector units, and that of Indian companies, there's a big gap. There is also the element of trying to induce competition between state-owned enterprises in China. Whereas in India, you know, we have this classic case of the DRDO, of the HAL, all being monopoly companies in India, and therefore not really achieving much by way of output. Mergers and acquisitions, again, you know, public sector units do not seem to engage in India. At least they don't seem to engage in much M&A abroad. And even our private companies that are engaged in M&A abroad tend to sort of go into sunset industries or vanity buys, a football club perhaps, or something like that. So in terms of the three US options that Dr. Joshi highlights, one, he talks about expanding restrictions as an option that the US have, but this is very likely to be only a short-term recourse. It cannot be a sustained long-term step. The other is to outcompete. But then this requires the Americans to give up their America first attitude and work with other countries as well. You know, it might require the Americans investing away from US in economies that are likely to give you more bang for the buck. And there, you know, India might have a chance, but currently the US has a very transactional approach. So I'm not sure whether this will also work. It depends on what the next administration, or if there's a new administration that comes in November, in January of next year in the US. Whether the persuasion is the third option that Dr. Joshi puts up. And I think to even consider this idea at this moment, especially with the kind of nature of regime that there is in China, is a big mistake. I think our lesson so far should tell us that this idea of persuading the Chinese simply doesn't work. We know what's happening on the LAC at the moment. So the question there is there a fourth option? Now, by way of conclusion, I think, I mean, if you look at the points that he talks about, the resilience of East Asian supply chains following COVID, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that East Asian economies were also inured to dealing with an epidemic from previous instances, whether it was MERS or SARS. They were already prepared for it. That sort of preparation did not exist across the world. The attraction of the Chinese as the world's largest consumer market. But this is a consumer market that the Chinese intend only to open up for their own companies or of countries that the Chinese choose to open up to. Offer MFN status, for example. It is not going to be open in any meaningful or significant way to the Europeans or to the Americans, except as a way of playing each against the other. And I would disagree perhaps with 2 points in the conclusion, which is that, a sounder approach for the US would be to work together with its allies, Japan and the EU, in inducing policy change in China. And I think I'd already mentioned that this is not going to happen, not under the current regime anyway. And to think that we can offer them an exit route. The second point is whether we can offer them an exit route perhaps by believing in the idea of there are reformers in China who will be strengthened if we are not completely hardline on China. I think that's again a misguided sort of an option. It's very difficult to find reformers in China, and those reformers in China probably want the Communist Party in China to continue in power, the same Atmanirbharta to continue in China. So the key point really in terms of consequences is what Dr. Joshi ended with, which is a question of standards. What we are likely to see with this decoupling is, as he said, 2 technospheres where 2 sets of standards are likely to operate in different parts of the world. And a set of American standards perhaps, and a set of Chinese standards. And the Chinese have already been working towards it. I mean, the BRI is essentially about also exporting Chinese standards. And the one final point that I'd like to make here is we have to be a little cognizant of the fact that if pressure increases on China, pressure increases on the Chinese economy, then what are the calculations that Chinese leaders are going to make in terms of their non-economic options? Perhaps military options, kinetic options, short-term conflicts, and so on. We've already seen one sort of something of that sort happening along the LAC in India. But it's something that we need to sort of keep in mind, that this is not just an economic issue, but this is also a political issue. And the set of calculations that Chinese leaders make is extremely different from what we sitting in Delhi or in DC might be able to make. And so therefore, really, the final question really is whether there is a third way and what forward out of both these difficult options for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Jibin. I think again a very fascinating set of comments on the evolving situation. I think this is going to be extremely difficult and challenging for any one country to manage. And I think towards the end you brought out, and of course Dr. Joshi also brought out as the economic and social impact on the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party of this decoupling effect. I think that's going to be a nation that is already in paranoia state of affairs, and if there are going to be significant social impact that also questions the legitimacy of the party in power, I think that's going to be, there are going to be much larger impact felt around the neighborhood, but also across. So without anyway, I think we are bang on time. So let me just, we have another 15 minutes for Q&A. So there are already a few questions out here. Let me read them out. Maybe 3 questions we'll take in the first round. Rahul Banerjee says, you mentioned about RCEP. Could you please explain how to sign a fair trade without compromising countries' interests? As we have seen most of the times, it always goes against national commercial interests. Although protectionism cannot go along with free trade, but national interest is also important. That's question number 1. Second, how is the clash between China and India in Eastern Ladakh going to affect the trade between the two, as the confrontation is likely to last much longer than envisaged? A third question is, do we have the wherewithal to decouple from China, as the ecosystem in India will take many years to develop? why do our experts, why were our experts silent all these years to make the country Atmanirbhar? Let me throw this question first to Dr. Manoj Joshi, and then we will take the next set of questions. Then I'll come back for a final set of comments to the discussants. Over to you, Joshi.
Okay. Well, the first question about RCEP. See, the thing is that what happens with RCEP, it's not just about tariffs. Tariffs are a very small part of an FTA like this. There are other issues involved. For example, you have issues. You have issues of regulation, standards, norms, public procurement. You know, all these come into in that particular FTA. And the advantage that India had now, if you are reshoring from China, moving away from China, you would much rather go to another RCEP country where you would be within an area with similar tariffs, similar rules, similar regulations. You see, so if you're a Japanese company, you want to move away from China, you move to Vietnam or you move to Philippines. But if you have India, then you have to have a completely different set of arrangements and agreements. So it is not in our interest to stay out of an agreement like that. And as I said, it's not just about tariffs. It's much more about a whole lot of other issues. Public procurement, for example, is an issue which many countries, Europeans are very taken up by issues relating to that. The second question about China and Eastern Ladakh. I think definitely this has been a kind of a watershed in Indian attitudes towards China. And I can only think that trade is, we are already in a situation where trade will be impacted by this development. Already we have seen restrictions on Chinese companies. Today, some newer restrictions have been announced. So I don't think there's any going back very quickly on that. There's a question on there's a third question on that wherewithal to decouple from China. You see, the thing is that I think we have to have a very clear understanding. Now, if you look at the kind of supply chain clusters, if you look at India's cluster like Pimpri Chinchwad, near Pune, that came up 30 years ago. Meaning you'd find it very difficult to find new clusters that have come up. And these things take time. Meaning Pimpri Chinchwad itself would have taken about 20, 30, 40 years to have come up. So if you look at Chinese high-tech zones, if you look at the Xi'an high-tech zone, it began in 1990 and it has matured by 2005, 2010. So we have the wherewithal. The problem is the lack of strategic planning. And we have to understand, unlike, we are a democratic country, we cannot keep on thinking of these issues in 5-year terms. Every election, we've got to think of these in kind of 10, 15, 20-year terms when we build up the industrial ecosystem systematically, when we acquire, when we direct. And that's where the Chinese have been very successful, because they're an authoritarian state and a centralized state. They've been able to direct investment in certain directions. And as Jabin pointed out, I was not able to, I didn't get into the Chinese Ganchao strategy, catch up and surpass. So they've been systematically working at that, funding students. In the railway sector, for example, we were more advanced than China in 1990. And today China is one of the world leaders in railway technology. How? Because of this process. And as according to one Chinese specialist, he says for every 1 yuan that we invested in importing technology, we spent 5 yuan in developing it. You see? So yes, we can, we do have the wherewithal, but what we do need is the strategic planning and multi-year effort to reach there.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. My question is, you talk about the new trade regime that is likely to come up and that should come up in a sense, because given this kind of high-tech competition that you're seeing, even in terms of technology, the return of technology export control regimes, Jebin pointed out to 2 sets of standards that might come about. How does that really fit within the overall trading pattern for the future in a sense? Because I think this is going to be very similar sets of issues do have play out in the security technologies, whether it is outer space, nuclear, and all the other ones, cyber, for instance. You have a set of transparency and confidence building measures on the one hand, then you have the need for the talk about the legally binding measures and so on and so forth. So if you're going to be, if you end up having essentially 2 sets of standards and or where the 2 essentially don't meet, how are you essentially going to set standards for future trading patterns and so on? So what does the new trade regime, economic trade regime would look like, and how does that really smoothen out the affairs among states, and what's your outlook on that aspect?
Well, in my view, I think one of the most important things is that the United States should get rid of this America First business. See, because what has happened is that in the last couple of years, the Europeans have also, what is the other major key technology exporting areas, which is Europe and Japan and South Korea. Now, if everyone works together, if they are able to work together, push the Chinese in certain, for example, the strategic thing. I think most countries didn't realize how important 5G would be, meaning, which is actually astonishing that the United States completely let go of the whole 5G thing, meaning it didn't even bother to compete. It's only now talking about 5G, realizing the revolutionary impact it would have. But you see, the United States has always had a technology restriction regime. Export control regime has always been there in the United States. And they have the CFIUS and they block companies. But the Europeans didn't have all that. And now the Europeans, the experience of the last couple of years, have started moving in that direction. Slowly, but because it's a huge this thing. And as far as the Japanese are concerned, Japanese are also very, very restrictive, meaning they don't share, they may not speak about it, but you can't access Japanese technology that easily. But my point here, and I don't agree with Japan out here, I think that the Chinese, if we can put up a united front of the various countries, I think the Chinese can be pushed because they have key vulnerabilities. Semiconductors is a very obvious vulnerability that has come up, and they're not going to be able to catch up no matter what they do in another 10 to 15 years. They're 10 to 15 years behind, so I'm not sure they'll be able to catch up. Plus, they have vulnerabilities in other areas, meaning there are a whole lot of things like precision bearings. The Europeans are still far better in those areas than the Chinese are. Now, the point is that if everyone gets together and say, well, this is where we draw the line. And I think just before the COVID, the world had come to the realization that the Chinese have been doing things they should not have been doing. The realization came rather late in the day. I agree. But it has come. And I think people are ready to act, but you need leadership. The problem is that the leader wants to go alone on an America First platform.
Absolutely. No, you summed it up so well. In a sense, if everyone gathered together, I think that's a key point out there. The US is actually right in confronting the China threat front and square, but at the same time going it alone. And I think that's been part of the problem. Instead of you could have kind of brought in all the European and other allies and partners together, that would have had a much more impactful effect on China. But let me now come to the 2 additional questions. Now, one. Mr. B.K. Agarwal says, as you mentioned, global decoupling from Chinese supply chain will take longer than wishful thinking. Should India not prepare a 3 to 5 year roadmap to capture the opportunities rather than creating hype across outlets? He also says, excellent overview. Mr. KPV says, the lessons learned about the consequences of the China first policy, even if late, should be welcomed. Therefore, steps towards finding alternative might reorient the US towards India, which should be pursued. That would put some pressure on China. Also, will decoupling lead to more bilateralism in trade than mega agreements? Dr. Joshi, would you want to take this?
I think that I think Mr. Agarwal's question I've already covered. I think certainly the important point here is that nothing can be, bilateralism is not a good idea. I think we have to move along with other countries, because if you don't do that, you lose out. And that's why I say that in RCEP, we are going to be the losers out of that. The second thing is, I think there needs to be a clear understanding that these are things which are not going to be done in 3 to 5 years. You have to have a longer perspective. And as I said, you have to have a longer perspective. You have to have, if you say, make in India 2025 or whatever it is, you must systematically work towards it. I mean, we've been talking about smart cities. I don't see anything happening in smart cities. We have had far too many slogans, and we have not had the action on the ground. And so there needs to be strategic focus from the highest level. You see, unfortunately, at the highest level, we are losing focus. Politics in India has become about politics, meaning politicking. And the point is that when it comes to governance, when it comes to strategic leadership in these very areas, we have been found wanting. So it is a moment of opportunity. The Prime Minister is right that this is a moment of opportunity, but the Prime Minister himself has not been providing that leadership, I'm afraid, Prime Minister and the government, towards setting up the kind of India we are talking about, meaning taking advantage of the opportunity. It's not enough. I mean, say when Yogi Adityanath says that he's going to offer American companies place in Uttar Pradesh, it's a joke. I come from Uttar Pradesh, meaning to think that people are going to reshore to Uttar Pradesh. Okay, Noida maybe, Greater Noida, okay. But if you are going to go somewhere in Mirzapur or Banaras or something like that, that's truly a joke. You've got to do much more. Meaning, if you're serious about this, you've got to do much, much more. And it's not that India hasn't done it. As I said, we have our industrial clusters. We have in Bangalore, we have in Chennai. We've been successful in the automobile, Manesar and this area, we have automobile clusters. It's possible. But now we need to expand them manifold. If we want to become part of if we want to become a great manufacturing country, which we have to become, because if we are not a manufacturing country, we can't employ all the people who are being pushed out of agriculture. So I think the issue here is systematic planning and leadership.
Dr. Joshi, one more question out there. Does Beijing have full control of the region? Remember how the Soviet Union imploded.
I didn't get that.
Does Beijing have full control of the regions? Remember how the Soviet Union imploded. I guess the question is more about China's ability to handle some of the questions like Xinjiang, Tibet, and so the various social issues, the ethnic minorities, and some of the regions that they come from, in a sense.
Actually, someone like Jabin would be much better in responding to that. The fact of the matter is, the minorities in China don't matter. Okay, they are in geographical areas which are not economically important areas, meaning Xinjiang and Tibet. In the heartland of China, and particularly the coastal areas, there are virtually no minorities to speak of. But it is true that social fracture can occur. And the thing with China is, Chinese history will teach us, is that unlike India, where with its diversity, if something happens in Punjab, nothing happens in Haryana. If something happens in Haryana, nothing happens in UP. We have a much more resilient society. China is not that resilient. And that's why they get scared of things like Hong Kong. They get scared of things like Tiananmen. I'm saying the Indians would just not bother about something like that, meaning, you have this water off a duck's back. But in China, they are very scared about that because that could crack the whole society. from one end to the other. It's a very brittle society.
Absolutely. You said it in a sense, a social fracture in China is a far more serious issue, and the manner in which China has gone about treating the Uyghurs and the Tibetans have much to worry about in a sense, and they are paranoid. And one of the paranoia comes from the internal security ramifications, whether it is Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghurs, how that's going to turn out. And that's also part of the problem as to why, for instance, the last few years, if you look at the internal security spending, expenditure on the internal security spending has been much larger than the defense expenditure. So that clearly shows where their vulnerabilities are, where their concerns and worries are. And so that's certainly an issue for them to worry about. But the manner in which they have been pumping money into Tibet Autonomous Region as well as Xinjiang Autonomous Region to kind of pushing economic and resources into there, but I think they've also been infusing Han nationalism into those areas. So that's part of their strategy so far to kind of sort of deal with that. But let me just give the two discussants their final say. Let me get them to talk about their final comments. Trisha?
No, I don't have any further comments. I think the other speakers have.
Okay, thank you. That's okay, Jabin?
Yeah, very quickly, 2 points. One, let me just start off with this last point about the ethnic minority areas. Yeah. I think it's important to remember that no matter which border region you take in China, despite the fact that they are minority areas, that they are comparatively weaker, with respect to the rest of the Chinese economy, all of those economies are actually stronger than the neighboring countries, the countries that they neighbor. Thus, Xinjiang is actually a driver in many ways for the other Central Asian economies. The other Central Asian economies, in fact, are the capitals of those countries are actually connected by air only via Xinjiang. They don't have direct flights between each other, but it's through Urumqi that their flights go. That's one thing. So in fact, if you look at it, that's a concern also for us because our border economies in India are not as strong as the Tibetan economies, as difficult as the situation might be in Tibet. So that's one thing. The second is taking off from this point that Dr. Joshi made about, about having to look beyond election cycles. If you look at any grand scheme in India, none of them have a date to it. The Chinese have the centenary goals, China should be a well-off society by 2021, or that should be a major power by 2049. If you look at Make in India, no date, no timeline, but Made in China, 2025. So there is a target. Skill India, no timeline. Digital India, no timeline. And therefore, if without a timeline, your officials also can't work or plan properly, as opposed to trying to create an impression of some immediate achievement having been made. And I think that's something that we need to get into our system, that we need to be patient. These things take time, and goals will necessarily only be achieved by planning for them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And I think that brings us to the sort of right on time. I want to conclude this, but I want to thank first the two discussants, both Trisha and Jabin, for taking the time to join us this morning for this discussion. And of course, Dr. Manoj Joshi for giving us a terrific paper to, and it's not one of those thick academic theory-oriented papers. It's a very easy to read, very lucidly explained the current state of the play in terms of the deglobalization, decoupling efforts, and I've enjoyed reading it. And those who have not seen the paper, it's available on the website, but along with your email invite, the link to the paper is there. So please do read. So let me thank both the discussants and of course all the participants for joining us this morning, and for those who asked the questions, and for giving us a good discussion this morning. So thank you all, and thank you for joining. Do join us for the next edition that will happen in the first week of August. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, everyone.